The Roman Empire fed millions, built aqueducts stretching over 400 kilometers, but they never tasted refined sugar. Not even their emperors knew sweetness the way we do. For over 3,000 years, entire civilizations conquered continents, built pyramids, invented algebra, all without sugar. And when it finally arrived in Europe, the first reaction wasn't delight, it was fear. And then, violence, colonization, slavery, revolutions, everything changed. This is the story of sugar, and the truth is darker than you imagined. Close your eyes and picture a medieval feast. Roaring fires, heavy oak tables, boar glazed with honey, a single candle flickering beside a cup of spiced wine. You expect pastries, cakes, puddings, but here's what they didn't tell you. There wasn't a grain of sugar in sight. For most of European history, sweetness was mythical, something travelers whispered about after returning from distant lands, something monks described in manuscripts like the Book of Divers Arts around 1150, a crystalline honey from the East, as rare as diamonds. Imagine walking through a market in 11th century Paris. The air smells of raw onions and wet wool. Bakers shout the price of coarse rye loaves. Fishmongers gut carp over wooden planks the color of rust. Children chew on apples, their only dessert. A pound of honey costs a week's wages. And sugar? It might as well be from the moon. But the contradiction grows stranger. European medical texts from the 9th to 12th centuries list remedies for nearly every ailment. Boils, grief, stomach fire. Yet almost none mention sugar. Physicians like Constantine the African and Hildegard of Bingen wrote treatises thousands of pages long. Yet sugar barely appears. Not because they forgot, but because Europeans had no access. Not to cane, not to crystals, not to plantations, nothing. Here's the shocking part. When sugar finally arrived, Europeans didn't use it for food. They used it as medicine. Apothecaries ground it, melted it, mixed it with herbs. Sugar became a treatment for fever, melancholy, even blindness. A powdered cure reserved for kings, abbots, and one or two lucky nobles. The average peasant in France or England could live and die without tasting sugar even once, not even on their wedding day. So the central question emerges. If Europe lived without sugar for over 1,000 years, where did sweetness hide? And who controlled it? Wait, it gets weirder. Because while Europe struggled to imagine sweetness, another empire halfway across the world had already mastered it. Imagine waking up in 1300 inside a stone cottage in northern England. The hearth smolders. The air smells of smoke, damp straw, and yesterday's pottage, barley, leeks, and maybe a scrap of salted pork if you're lucky. You reach for breakfast, not porridge with sugar, not jam, just coarse bread so hard it scrapes your gums. Sweetness is a luxury your tongue may never meet. Medieval Europe substituted sugar with three things: honey, fruit, and spices, each more precious than the last. Honey was the main sweetener, but even that wasn't common. A skilled beekeeper in 13th century France might harvest 20 to 30 kilograms a year, and monasteries like the Abbey of Cluny guarded their apiaries like treasure vaults. Honey was medicine, currency, and sacred offering. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly gifted jars of holy honey to monasteries, claiming it cured fatigue and damp humors. But here's what they didn't tell you. Most peasants rarely tasted honey. Nobles hoarded it. Cities fought over it. Medieval tax records from Rouen and Ghent list honey among controlled commodities, alongside armor and grain. The poor settled for berries, apples, pears, seasonal treats that disappeared for most of the year. Winters tasted bitter, sharp, metallic. So Europe leaned heavily on spices: cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg shipped through Arab traders into Venetian ports. These weren't sweeteners, but the aromas tricked the senses. A meat pie with saffron felt indulgent. A wafer dusted with cinnamon tasted almost like dessert. Almost. But here's the shocking part. Sugar existed in Europe by the 12th century, introduced by returning Crusaders. Yet it was so rare a single kilogram cost more than a horse. Kings bought it by the ounce. Apothecaries locked it in iron boxes. Court records from the reign of Henry III mention 3 ounces of sugar for the king's physic. 3 ounces. That was a royal supply. In London, a merchant guild known as the Pepperers handled the city's tiny imports. Their ledgers describe sugar using the same language as gemstones: white as marble, clear as glass, purer than alabaster. It wasn't food. It wasn't spice. It was status. Imagine medieval cooks preparing a feast at the court of Edward I. They make subtleties, sugar sculptures shaped like castles, saints, swans. They look delicious, but taste awful, chalky and burnt. They weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to proclaim wealth. And here's the part historians argue about. Some claim medieval elites used these sugar sculptures as political propaganda, edible illusions demonstrating divine power. Others argue they were simply displays of luxury. But one thing is certain: sugar wasn't made for the stomach. It was made for the eyes. Europe survived without sugar when using spices for illusion, honey for medicine, and fruit for fleeting joy. But an empire far to the east had already unlocked sweetness itself, and what they created would change the world. Travel now to the Indian subcontinent, 2,000 years before medieval Europe even dreamed of refined sweetness. The air is humid. Palm trees sway over fields of towering cane. Workers slice through emerald stalks with bronze blades. The scent hits first, grassy, warm, almost floral. This is the birthplace of true sugar. Here's the shocking part. Long before Europe used sugar as medicine, India had already mastered crystallized sugar. Not syrup, not honey, actual crystals. Hard, dry, portable. The Sanskrit word sharkara, meaning gravel or pebbles, gave us the modern word sugar. Ancient Indian texts like the Karaka Samhita, circa 100 BCE, and the Sushruta Samhita describe multiple forms: liquid jaggery, solid cakes, fine crystals. Physicians classified sugar by texture, color, and even seasonality. By around 500 CE, the Gupta Empire exported sugar to Persia, carried by caravans across the Hindu Kush. The Persian emperor Darius I referred to sugarcane juice as the reed that gives honey without bees, a marvel of nature, both botanical and economic. But the real story gets stranger. Indian artisans invented a technique that Europe wouldn't figure out for over a millennium: clarification. They boiled cane juice with lime, calcium oxide, removing impurities and allowing pure crystals to form. This was chemistry centuries ahead of its time. Archaeologists excavating sites in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh have found remnants of early sugar molds, terracotta cones stained with caramelized residue. While Europe used honey to sweeten its medicines, Indian households used sugar in daily cooking. Imagine the kitchen: clay pots simmering, milk slowly thickening into kheer, ghee sizzling in a bronze pan as dough puffs into golden sweets, children nibbling on tiny sugar lumps like modern candies. Sweetness wasn't luxury, it was culture. But here's what they didn't tell you: sugar didn't stay in India. Buddhist monks carried refining techniques into China around the 7th century. The Tang dynasty embraced it. By the reign of Emperor Taizong, Chinese courts used sugar for medicines, fruit preserves, and even sculptures similar to Europe's subtleties, but edible. Still, a barrier remained. Europe had no cane, no climate for it, no scientific knowledge, no trade routes. Sweetness was locked behind deserts, mountains, and empires. The world was effectively split in two: a West without sugar, an East that treated it as everyday life. And when these two worlds finally met, what happened next changed everything. Picture the year. In 1099, Jerusalem falls to the First Crusade. The air is thick with smoke, iron, and dust. European knights, exhausted, dehydrated, half-starved, stumble through markets unlike anything they've seen before. Spices, almond oil, silk, and then something miraculous. A crystal, white, fragile, sweet beyond imagination. Sugar, not honey, not fruit. Pure sweetness that melts on the tongue like snow touched by sunlight. Chroniclers such as William of Tyre wrote of sweet salt and honeyed stones. The Crusaders initially thought it was medicine. Some believed it was a spice. A few suspected it was alchemical. But the truth is stranger. Many Crusaders feared sugar. Why? Because it came from Islamic lands, from the enemy, from cultures Europeans barely understood. To them, sugar felt unnatural, sweetness that did not come from bees, suspicious, even demonic. But then, everything changed. When Crusaders marched deeper into the Levant, they saw something that shook them: plantations, organized fields of cane stretching across Syria and Palestine, irrigated by complex aqueduct systems built centuries earlier by Arab engineers. Workers, local peasants, and prisoners of war labored with sickles and ox carts. Overseers boiled the cane juice in massive cauldrons. The scent drifted over the desert: burnt caramel, smoke, ash. The Europeans had never seen agriculture scaled like this. In 1102, Crusaders seized sugar mills in Acre and Tripoli. By 1148, Knights Hospitaller controlled plantations themselves, running some of the earliest European-owned sugar operations outside Europe. But they didn't know how to refine it properly. Much of their sugar burned. Crystallization failed. Productivity lagged. Arab sugar masters still held the secrets. Here's the shocking part. Historical records from the Geniza documents of Fustat describe sugar as one of the most valuable commodities of the medieval Mediterranean, more expensive than rare spices, more coveted than many metals. Venetian merchants risked piracy and storms to smuggle small bundles back to Europe. Not all made it. In 1187, when Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, he burned fields and seized mills to prevent Crusaders from regaining control. Sugar became a weapon, a resource of war. Meanwhile, in Europe, sugar's reputation evolved from strange medicine to elite indulgence. Kings demanded it. Apothecaries raised prices. Chroniclers described it as white gold, a term that would later echo across the Atlantic. Here's where it gets weird. Some early European physicians, like Matthias Platearius of the 12th century circa Instans, warned sugar could heat the blood excessively. Others called it a cure-all. The contradictions only fueled intrigue. By 1204, when Crusaders sacked Constantinople, they encountered vast stores of sugar in imperial warehouses. They plundered it alongside jewels, icons, and gold. Sugar had become treasure. Yet Europe still lacked one critical thing: land suited for cane. The climate was too cold, the growing season too short. Sugar was desired, loved, worshipped. But Europe could not produce it, not yet. And that led to a decision so devastating it reshaped continents, displaced millions, and forged an empire built on suffering. Because when European rulers realized they couldn't grow sugar at home, they looked elsewhere, far across the sea, and nothing would ever be the same. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was hooked. Not outwardly, not publicly, but behind monastery walls, inside royal kitchens, tucked in apothecary drawers. Sweetness had become an obsession, a quiet addiction, and Europe would do anything to feed it. Here's the shocking part. Between 1300 and 1600, sugar consumption in Europe increased more than 20-fold. Not because people suddenly understood the chemistry, not because tastes evolved naturally, but because elites, kings, bishops, bankers, demanded it. Sugar became the centerpiece of royal feasts. In the court of Edward III of England, banquet records list 40 pounds of sugar for subtleties during a single celebration in 1340. Meanwhile, peasants living less than a mile away might go their entire lives without tasting a single grain. This was a luxury war, fought with silver, ships, and slaves. Europe still couldn't grow sugarcane. Cane needed heat, humidity, and fertile soil. But Europe had something else. The Mediterranean islands. Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, Madeira, the Canary Islands. And the moment Europeans realized these islands could grow cane, they turned them into laboratories for empire. In 1420, Portuguese settlers on Madeira planted the island's first cane. Within decades, Madeira became the sugar capital of Europe. Chronicler Gomes Eanes de Zurara described forests burned, villages emptied, fields cleared, an environmental transformation so rapid it terrified locals. But the profits were irresistible. Madeira exported thousands of tons. Venice and Genoa brokered the trade. Northern Europeans paid fortunes for it. But the real story gets darker. Madeira's plantations needed labor. Brutal labor. Endless cutting, boiling, hauling. Cane must be processed within hours of being cut, or it spoils. Workers toiled in blistering heat beside boiling cauldrons. Many died from burns, exhaustion, dehydration. So plantation owners turned to enslaved labor. At first, they targeted Guanche Islanders from the Canary Islands, then Africans from the Senegambia region. By 1480, enslaved workers formed the backbone of the Mediterranean sugar economy. This is where it gets weird. The plantation model developed on Madeira, São Tomé, and the Canaries became the blueprint for the Atlantic slave system, a system that would soon grow far beyond Europe's control. By the 1500s, sugar consumption spread among the European middle class. Doctors claimed it balanced humors. Priests believed it restored strength during fasting. Nobles swore it cured melancholy. Whether these claims were real or fantasy didn't matter. Demand exploded. No one saw this coming. By 1570, Portuguese explorers transported the plantation model across the Atlantic to Brazil. There, the climate was perfect. The soil was rich, and European merchants realized something terrifying. Sugar grown in Brazil could be produced 10 times cheaper than anywhere in Europe. Sugar prices plummeted. Consumption skyrocketed. And the insatiable demand for labor ignited the transatlantic slave trade on a scale never seen before. Historians debate the exact numbers, but most agree. Over 5 million enslaved Africans were transported to sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean between the 1500s and the 1800s. Sugar wasn't just a commodity. It was an engine of suffering. Europe's sweet addiction had become a global catastrophe. Sugar wasn't just a luxury anymore. It was becoming a daily craving, and Europe couldn't get enough. Tea tasted better with sugar. Coffee tasted better. Chocolate tasted better. And soon, even medicines and breads were being sweetened. But with every spoonful of sweetness consumed in Europe, the brutal machinery behind it grew larger. European empires scrambled to build more plantations, seize more islands, and expand their foothold along African coasts. The demand was simple and horrifying. More sugar required more enslaved human beings. Ships that left Europe carrying guns and manufactured goods returned with human cargo. Men, women, and children, shackled tightly in holds with barely enough room to breathe. The Middle Passage became one of the most horrific chapters in human history. By the late 1700s, sugar plantations had become the largest death zones in the Atlantic world. Sugar wasn't just profitable, it was catastrophically profitable. On some Caribbean islands, the average enslaved worker lived only 7 to 8 years after arrival. Plantation owners didn't care. It was cheaper to work people to death and replace them than to treat them as human beings. And all this suffering was fueled by a single consumer desire: to make bitter things taste sweet. While Europe enjoyed cakes, pastries, and sweetened drinks, entire populations were being displaced and destroyed across Africa and the Caribbean. By the 1800s, doctors were already noticing something strange. People who consumed a lot of sugar didn't just enjoy it, they craved it intensely. Long before we understood dopamine pathways or blood sugar spikes, physicians wrote about sugar as if describing a drug. People couldn't stop eating it. They felt uneasy without it. They needed more to feel satisfied. What began as a luxury ingredient had become an early global addiction, silently rewiring diets and health patterns across continents. Fast forward to the 1960s. Medical researchers were observing alarming connections between sugar and heart disease. But the sugar industry launched one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in history. They paid scientists, including Harvard researchers, to shift the blame to dietary fat, protecting sugar's reputation for decades. That one cover-up changed global dietary guidelines, and millions of people paid the price. Processed foods exploded. Sugary cereals became healthy breakfast. Soft drinks became normal daily beverages. Sugar was hidden in ketchup, bread, sauces, snacks, everywhere. Consumption skyrocketed. And now, the consequences Napoleon feared, the consequences doctors warned about centuries ago, are happening today. Type 2 diabetes, obesity, chronic inflammation, heart disease. Modern science has finally caught up with what history always hinted. Sugar shaped civilizations, but also destroyed countless lives. Sugar built empires. It toppled kingdoms. It rewired taste buds and rewrote human history. But here's the irony. The real danger was never the sweetness itself. It was our willingness to ignore the cost. For centuries, sugar hid behind celebration. Weddings, festivals, birthdays, comfort food, morning routines. But behind every spoonful lies the ghost of its past. The plantations that swallowed entire generations. The ships that carried human beings like cargo. The wars fought over tiny Caribbean islands. The silent epidemics that modern medicine tried to explain away. Sugar was never just an ingredient. It was a force powerful enough to reshape the world. And today, it still controls us. Every craving, every snack, every just one more, echoes a history most people never hear. The dark side of sugar wasn't left in the past. It lives in our kitchens, in our habits, in our health. So the next time sweetness touches your tongue, remember, empires rose for it. Empires killed for it. And in many ways, we're still paying the price. The history of sugar didn't end. It simply changed form. And we're still living inside its story.